The rain was a beast that night, a relentless force pounding the roof of my old pickup truck as I drove home from the hardware store in town. I'd stayed late, longer than I'd meant to, picking up a bag of nails and a new hammer for a project that had been nagging at me for weeks, fixing the porch railing before it gave up entirely and sent me tumbling into the dirt. The wipers thrashed back and forth across the windshield, smearing the deluge more than clearing it, and the world outside was a murky swirl of gray and shadow, the kind of night that makes you crave a warm fire and a locked door. I'd lived out here, 10 miles from anything resembling civilization, long enough to know these storms could turn a quiet evening into something wild, but I wasn't expecting what came next. I was about a mile from my turnoff, a lonely stretch of road hemmed in by towering pines that loomed like silent sentinels, when the sound hit me, a scream sharp and raw, slicing through the rain like a blade through cloth. My foot eased off the gas, the truck slowing as my heart gave a sudden thud against my ribs. At first I tried to chalk it up to the storm, a fox caught in the wind, maybe, or an owl startled from its perch. I'd heard plenty of strange noises out here over the years, the woods full of life that didn't care much for human company. But then it came again, louder, unmistakably human, and laced with a terror that made my skin prickle. There was no ignoring that. I pulled the truck to the shoulder, the tires crunching over gravel and sinking into the soft, rain-soaked earth. My breath fogged in the cab as I reached into the glove box for my flashlight, its cold metal reassuring in my grip. I hesitated, peering through the streaked glass one last time, half hoping I'd imagined it. But the scream echoed in my head, and I knew sitting there wasn't an option. I pushed the door open, the wind snatching at it, and stepped out, my boots squelching in the mud. The rain hit me like a slap, soaking through my jacket in seconds, but I clicked the flashlight on, its beam cutting a narrow path through the downpour. "Hello?" I called, my voice thin against the storm's roar, swallowed up by the wind and the drumming rain. No answer came, just the relentless patter on leaves and the creak of branches bending under the weight of the weather. I took a few steps toward the trees, the light sweeping over glistening trunks and tangled undergrowth, my pulse ticking up with every breath. I wasn't a brave man by nature, practical, sure, handy with a tool belt, but not the type to go looking for trouble. Trouble, though, had a way of finding me tonight. Then I saw them, maybe 30 yards off the road, two figures locked in a struggle that the storm couldn't quite hide. One was a woman, her hair plastered to her face like dark ink, her arms thrashing as she fought to break free. The other was a man, tall and wiry, his grip on her wrist unyielding, his posture hunched like a hunter cornering prey. He was shouting something, his voice a low growl beneath the wind, but the words didn't carry, just the menace in them did. My flashlight caught them fully then, and I saw her face twist toward me, her eyes wide with desperation, pleading without a sound. The man's head snapped up, his gaze locking onto the beam, and for a split second I saw his eyes, wild, glinting like a cornered animal's. That's when the light hit his hand, and I caught the flash of a blade, short and wicked, clutched tight against her side. My stomach dropped, a cold wave washing over me. I didn't know who they were or how they'd ended up here, but that knife changed everything. "Hey!" I yelled, my voice finding strength I didn't know I had, and I charged toward them, the flashlight raised like a club, my boots pounding the wet earth. This wasn't my fight, not yet, but I'd just made it mine. The sight of that blade sent a jolt through me, like ice water in my veins. I didn't know who this guy was or what he wanted with her, but I wasn't about to let him finish whatever he'd started. "Let her go," I shouted, my voice steadier than I felt. The man froze, his head cocked like a predator sizing me up. The woman twisted in his grip, her eyes wide with terror, locking onto mine as if I were her last hope. He didn't let go. Instead, he yanked her closer, the knife flashing as he pressed it to her side. "Stay out of this, hero," he snarled, his voice rough like gravel. "This ain't your business." The rain stung my face, but I kept the flashlight trained on him, my other hand tightening around the hammer I'd grabbed from the truck. I wasn't a fighter, not by trade anyway, but I'd swung that hammer enough times to know it could do some damage. "Looks like it is now," I said, stepping closer. The woman whimpered, and I saw her elbow jab back, catching him in the ribs. It wasn't much, but it was enough. His grip loosened for a heartbeat, and she broke free, stumbling toward me. "Run!" I yelled, waving her past me toward the truck. She didn't hesitate, her footsteps splashing through the mud as she bolted. The man lunged after her, but I was already moving. I swung the flashlight, aiming for his arm, and it connected with a dull thud. He hissed, the knife dropping into the wet leaves, and for a moment I thought that'd be it. But then he turned on me, his eyes burning with something feral. He tackled me hard and we hit the ground, the air rushing out of my lungs. The hammer slipped from my hand, lost in the muck, and his fists came down like pistons. I rolled, shoving him off, and scrambled to my feet. He was up too, faster than I expected, but I didn't wait to see what he'd do next. I sprinted for the truck, where the woman was clawing at the passenger door, her hands shaking. "Get in," I shouted, diving for the driver's side. Behind me I heard him roar, his boots pounding the earth. This wasn't over, not yet. I yanked the truck door open and threw myself inside, the keys jangling as I fumbled them into the ignition. The woman was already in the passenger seat, her breaths coming in ragged gasps, her hands pressed against the dashboard like she could will the truck to move. "Go, go," she cried, her voice trembling but fierce. I twisted the key and the engine sputtered once, my heart stopped, then roared to life. Through the rain-streaked window, I saw him charging toward us, a dark silhouette against the trees. He was close, too close. His hand slammed against the tailgate as I floored the gas, the tires spinning in the mud before catching traction. The truck lurched forward, fishtailing onto the road, and I gripped the wheel tight, my knuckles white. "Hold on," I said, glancing at her. She nodded, her face pale but determined. The rearview mirror showed him receding, his figure swallowed by the storm, but I didn't ease up. My pulse hammered in my ears, louder than the rain battering the roof. "You okay?" I asked, risking a look at her. She was soaked, her coat torn at the sleeve, but she managed a shaky nod. "Yeah, I think so," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," I muttered, checking the mirror again. The road stretched empty behind us, but I couldn't shake the feeling he wasn't done. "Who was that guy?" She hesitated, her fingers twisting together in her lap. I don't know his name," she said finally. "He just came out of nowhere. Grabbed me off the path." I frowned. The path she meant had to be the old trail that cut through the woods, a shortcut folks used to get to the gas station a mile up. "You were walking out here? In this?" She bit her lip, nodding. "My car broke down. I thought I could make it before the storm got bad. Bad luck didn't even begin to cover it. The truck rattled as we hit a pothole and I swerved to steady us. "We're not far from my place," I said. "You can dry off there, figure out what's next." She looked at me, her eyes searching mine, and I wondered what she saw. A stranger? A savior? Either way, we weren't out of the woods yet, literally or otherwise. The truck growled up the dirt drive to my house, the headlights sweeping over the sagging porch and the flickering glow of a single lamp I'd left on inside. The rain hadn't let up, hammering the tin roof as I cut the engine. "This is it," I said, turning to her. She stared out the window, her expression unreadable, then gave a small nod. "Looks safe," she murmured, almost to herself. I climbed out and circled to her side, opening the door. She stepped down gingerly, wincing as her shoes sank into the soggy ground. "Careful," I said, offering a hand. She took it, her grip surprisingly firm, and I led her up the steps. The porch creaked under our weight, but it held, just like always. Inside, I flicked on the lights, revealing the modest living room. A worn couch, a coffee table stacked with woodworking magazines, and the fireplace I'd been meaning to use. "Sit," I said, pointing to the couch. "I'll get a fire going." She sank down, peeling off her soaked coat, and I grabbed some logs from the stack by the hearth. As the kindling caught, the room filled with a warm crackle, chasing off the damp chill. I glanced back at her. She was shivering, arms wrapped around herself, but her eyes were alert, darting around like she was cataloging every detail. "You got a name?" I asked, tossing another log on the fire. She hesitated, then said, "Clara?" Her voice was soft but steady now. "I'm Daniel," I replied, brushing soot off my hands. "You're lucky I was driving by." She managed a faint smile. "Luck doesn't usually find me like that." I grabbed a blanket from the armchair and handed it to her. "Warm up. I'll make some coffee." In the kitchen I set the pot brewing, my mind racing. Who was that guy? Why her? The questions gnawed at me, but I didn't push, not yet. When I returned, she was wrapped in the blanket, staring into the flames. "You live alone out here?" she asked, her tone casual but probing. "Yeah," I said, setting a mug in front of her. "Keeps things simple." She took the coffee, her fingers brushing mine, and looked up at me. "Simple's good," she said, but there was something in her eyes, gratitude maybe, or something deeper. I couldn't tell. Not yet. The storm raged on outside, but in here the quiet was heavy, full of unspoken things. The fire popped and hissed, sending sparks up the chimney as Clara sipped her coffee, the blanket pulled tight around her shoulders. I sat across from her in the armchair, nursing my own mug, the warmth seeping into my hands. The storm still battered the windows, but in here, it felt like we'd carved out a little pocket of calm. Still, my mind wouldn't settle. Those wild eyes in the rain, that knife kept flashing back. "You sure you don't know that guy?" I asked, keeping my tone light. Clara's fingers tightened on her mug, and she stared into the dark liquid like it held answers. "I'd never seen him before," she said finally. "He just appeared. Said something about me owing him, but I didn't even know what he meant." Her voice wavered and she shook her head. "It doesn't make sense." I leaned back, frowning. "Sounds like he thought you were someone else." She shrugged, but her eyes flicked to the window, quick and nervous. "Maybe," she said, though she didn't sound convinced. I wanted to press her. Something about her story felt off, like a puzzle piece that didn't fit, but she looked so fragile I let it drop. "For now. Guess it doesn't matter," I said, standing to poke the fire. "You're here, he's not." The logs shifted, sending up a plume of embers, and I heard her shift on the couch. "Daniel," she said, her voice softer now, "why'd you stop?" Most people would have kept driving. I paused, the poker still in hand, and glanced at her. Her eyes were steady on me, searching again. "Dunno," I admitted, setting the poker aside. "Heard you scream, figured I couldn't just leave it." She smiled faintly, a real one this time, and it softened her face. "Not many would have done that," she said. "You're a good man." I shrugged, feeling a flush creep up my neck. Just did what felt right. The room fell quiet again, save for the fire and the rain. Clara set her mug down and pulled the blanket closer. "I should call someone about my car," she said, but she didn't move. "Phone's over there." I nodded toward the kitchen. She glanced at it, then back at me. "In a minute," she said, and I got the sense she wasn't in a hurry to leave. Neither was I, truth be told, not until I knew more. The firelight danced across Clara's face as she sat there, the blanket a cocoon around her. I watched her for a moment, trying to read the lines of tension still etched in her brow. She'd said she didn't know the man, but there was a weight to her words, like she was carrying more than she let on. I didn't push, yet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the storm outside wasn't the only thing chasing her. "You warm enough?" I asked, nodding at the fire. She glanced up, her lips curving slightly. "Yeah, thanks. This is nice." Her voice had a lilt to it now, a hint of ease creeping in. I got up to refill my coffee, more to keep my hands busy than anything else. "Glad to hear it," I said over my shoulder. "Not every night I get company out here." When I turned back, she was watching me, her head tilted like she was piecing something together. "You don't get lonely?" she asked. I set the pot down, considering. "Sometimes," I said. "But I like the quiet. Gives me space to think." She nodded, slow and thoughtful. "I get that. I used to crave quiet too, before everything got so loud." I raised an eyebrow, leaning against the counter. "Loud how?" She hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of the mug. "Just life," she said, vague enough to dodge the question. "Work, people, all of it." I let it slide, but that vague answer only stoked my curiosity. What kind of life put her on that path tonight? She shifted, tucking her legs under her. "Daniel," she said, her tone shifting, "I don't know how to thank you. What you did back there, it wasn't nothing." I waved it off, but she leaned forward, insistent. "No, really. I want to do something for you. Something real." Her eyes were earnest, almost fierce, and it caught me off guard. "You don't owe me anything," I said, crossing back to the armchair. "Anyone would've," she cut me off with a shake of her head. "Not anyone. You." The way she said it, like it was a fact carved in stone, made me pause. I sat down, meeting her gaze. "All right," I said slowly. "What did you have in mind?" She smiled, a spark lighting her face. "I'll figure it out," she said, and there was a promise in it, a promise that felt bigger than the room. Outside, the wind howled, but in here, something was shifting, and I wasn't sure where it'd lead. The fire had settled into a steady glow, casting long shadows across the room as Clara leaned back, her eyes still fixed on me. That promise in her voice hung between us, thick as the smoke curling up the chimney. I shifted in the armchair, unsure what to make of it. "Figure it out, huh?" I said, keeping my tone light. "That's a tall order." She laughed, a small bright sound that cut through the quiet. "I'm good at tall orders," she said, and there was a confidence there I hadn't noticed before. The scared woman from the woods was still in her, but something else was waking up, something steady and sure. "Besides," she added, "you deserve it. I owe you my life." I rubbed the back of my neck, uneasy with the weight of that. "Clara, I'm not some knight in shining armor. I just happened to be there." She shook her head, her damp hair catching the light. That's exactly why it matters, she said. You didn't have to stop, but you did. That's rare. I didn't argue, couldn't really with her looking at me like that. Instead, I sipped my coffee, letting the silence stretch. Outside, the rain had eased to a drizzle, the wind a low murmur now. So, I said finally, what's this, something real you're cooking up? Her smile turned sly, like she'd been waiting for me to ask. I don't know yet, she admitted, but it'll be good. Something you'd never expect. She paused, then added, what do you like, Daniel? What makes you tick? The question threw me. Most folks didn't care enough to ask, and I wasn't used to answering. Simple stuff, I said. Fixing things. Woodwork. A quiet night like this. Well, minus the maniac part. She nodded, filing it away. Good to know, she said, and I could almost see the wheels turning in her head. I'll come up with something perfect. There was a determination in her now, like she'd latched onto this idea of thanking me and wouldn't let go. It was flattering, sure, but it also made me wonder, what drove her to push so hard? You don't have to rush, I said, setting my mug down. You're safe here. Take your time. She looked at me, her expression softening. I know, she said. That's why I want to do it right. The fire crackled and I felt the night shift again, toward something I couldn't quite name. The clock on the mantel ticked past midnight, but neither of us seemed ready to call it a night. The fire was down to embers now, a soft red glow that warmed the room just enough. Clara sat cross-legged on the couch, the blanket draped over her lap, her coffee long gone. She'd stopped shivering, and that fierce spark in her eyes was growing brighter. Woodwork, huh? She said, circling back to what I'd told her. You make things? Like furniture? I nodded, leaning forward in the armchair. Yeah, mostly small stuff, shelves, boxes. Keeps my hands busy. Her face lit up like she'd struck gold. That's it then, she said, clapping her hands together. I'll thank you with something you can build. I blinked, caught off guard. Build? She grinned, leaning toward me. Not just anything, something special. Something, from me. Her excitement was contagious, but I still didn't follow. Like a blueprint? I asked. She shook her head, her damp hair bouncing. No better. You'll see. I just need a little time to figure it out. I couldn't help but smile at her enthusiasm. You're a planner, aren't you? She laughed again, that bright sound filling the room. Guilty, she said. I used to organize everything, events, projects. Before, she trailed off, her gaze drifting to the window. There it was again, that shadow of something unsaid. Before what? I asked, gentle but curious. She bit her lip, then shrugged. Before I ended up walking in the rain, I guess. It was a dodge and we both knew it, but I let it go. Whatever she was holding back, it wasn't my place to pry, not yet. Still, it nagged at me, that gap in her story. All right, I said, standing to stretch. You've got time. I'm not kicking you out. She looked up, gratitude softening her features. Good, she said, because I'm not done with you yet. There was a playful edge to it, but also a promise, one I was starting to believe she'd keep. I grabbed another log for the fire, tossing it on. You should get some rest, I said. Guest room's down the hall. She nodded, but her eyes lingered on me, thoughtful. Daniel, she said as I turned away, you're more than you think you are. I paused, not sure how to answer that. Night, Clara, I said instead, and headed for my room, her words echoing in my head. Morning broke gray and still, the storm finally spent. I woke to the smell of coffee, not mine but fresh brewed, and found Clara in the kitchen, rummaging through my cabinets. Hope you don't mind, she said, holding up a mug. Figured I'd make myself useful. I waved it off, grabbing a cup for myself. You're a guest, not a maid. She smiled, but there was a restless energy in her, like she'd been up for hours. Papers were scattered on the table, napkins mostly covered in scribbled sketches. What's all this? I asked, peering over her shoulder. She tapped one with a pencil I didn't even know I owned. Your thank you, she said. I've got it. I pulled up a chair, studying the drawing. A small, intricate box with carved patterns, hinges, and a lid that looked like it locked. A box. I said, impressed despite myself. Not just a box, she corrected. A memory box. Something to hold what matters. I'll design it, you build it. Her eyes shone with pride, and I had to admit, it was clever. Never made anything this fancy, I said, tracing the sketch. You'll figure it out, she replied, confident. I'll help with the details. It'll be ours, together. The way she said it, ours, stuck with me, warm and strange at once. Deal? I said, and her grin widened. We spent the morning refining it, her sketching, me suggesting cuts and joints. She had a knack for this, a focus I hadn't expected. "You've done this before?" I said, half a question. She nodded, not looking up. "Used to plan bigger things, fundraisers, exhibits. Loved making ideas real." There I was again, used to. I opened my mouth to ask, but a sharp knock at the door cut me off. We both froze. "You expecting someone?" she whispered. I shook my head, my gut tightening. The knock came again, harder. I stood, motioning her to stay put, and crept to the window. Peering through the curtain, I saw a man, tall, wiry, soaked from the night before. My heart sank. "Clara," I said, low and urgent, "he's back." Her face drained of color, but she didn't panic. "What do we do?" she asked, voice steady. I grabbed my phone, already dialing. "Lock the doors," I said. "We're not running this time." The line rang as his shadow loomed closer, and I knew whatever she wasn't telling me, it was catching up fast. The phone trembled in my hand as the dispatcher's voice crackled through. "Sheriff's on the way, sir. Stay calm and secure the house." I hung up, my eyes locked on the front door where the maniac's shadow hovered, his fist pounding again, slow, deliberate, like he knew we were trapped. Clara stood behind me, her sketches clutched to her chest, her breath shallow but her jaw set. "He won't stop," she whispered, and there was a crack in her voice that hadn't been there before. "Who is he, Clara?" I demanded, turning to her. "No more dodging. He's here, and I need to know what I'm fighting." She swallowed hard, her eyes darting to the window, then back to me. "His name's Victor," she said finally, the words tumbling out. "He worked for me years ago. I ran an art gallery, high-end stuff. He was security, but he got greedy, started stealing. I caught him, turned him in. He went to prison. Guess he's out now." I stared at her, pieces clicking into place. Her planning skills, her vague past, the way Victor had grabbed her like she owed him something. "He thinks you ruined him," I said. She nodded, guilt shadowing her face. "I didn't know he'd come after me. Not like this." The pounding stopped, replaced by a scraping sound, metal on wood. He was trying the lock. I grabbed the hammer from the counter, my pulse racing. "Stay back," I told her, moving to the door. "Sheriff's coming, but I'm not letting him in." Clara stepped forward instead, her hand on my arm. "No, Daniel. Together." Her voice was firm, and I saw that spark again, the one that had dreamed up the memory box. I nodded, gripping the hammer tighter. The scraping turned to a thud. He was ramming the door now, the frame splintering. I braced myself, Clara beside me, when headlights swept through the window. Sirens wailed, close and loud, and the thudding stopped. Through the curtain, I saw Victor freeze, then bolt for the trees as red and blue lights flooded the yard. The sheriff's deputies were on him in seconds, tackling him into the mud. I let out a breath I hadn't known I was holding. Clara sank onto the couch, trembling but relieved. "It's over," she said, more to herself than me. I set the hammer down, joining her as the deputies cuffed Victor and hauled him off. "Yeah," I said, "looks like it." The room felt bigger now, the tension draining away with the rain's last drips outside. We sat in silence until the sheriff came in, took our statements, and promised Victor wouldn't see daylight for a while. Assault, stalking, the works. When he left, Clara turned to me, her eyes soft but fierce. "You saved me again," she said. "That box. It's not enough." I shook my head. "You don't owe me, Clara. We got through it. That's what counts." She smiled, a real one, and pulled the sketches from her lap. "Maybe not," she said, "but I'm finishing it anyway. For us." Over the next few days she stayed, insisting on it despite my protests. We worked together in my shed, her sketching, me sawing and sanding. The memory box took shape, oak with swirling carvings she'd designed, a lock that clicked just right. It was beautiful, better than anything I'd made alone. The day she left, her car fixed and Victor locked away, she handed me the finished box. "For what matters," she said, echoing her promise. Inside she tucked a note, "To Daniel, my quiet hero. Keep this full of good things. Clara." I watched her drive off, the box in my hands, warm and solid. She'd thanked me, sure, but it felt like more, like we'd built something neither of us expected. Years later, that box sits on my mantel, holding odds and ends, a nail from that night, a sketch she'd left behind. Every time I open it, I hear her laugh, see her spark. The storm's long gone, but what it brought, that stays.